Hey there, Cinemaster fans! Hope you're ready for some movie magic. Let's dive right in. This story takes place in 1865 in the state of Tennessee during the American Civil War. Edward Young was with a group of soldiers facing a terrifying group of zombies that suddenly appeared after the end of the war. 6 years had passed since this nightmare began. Edward lost everything. One day, after being away for a couple of days, he returned home to find his wife turned into a monster due to disease. He had no choice but to shoot her to end her suffering. However, the catastrophe was that his son Adam disappeared, and no one knew where he went. Since then, Edward carried a small notebook documenting everything he observed about the zombies. He discovered that the only way to kill them was to destroy their brains, and because they moved slowly, long-range weapons became the best solution. One day, Edward captured his old neighbor Charles, who had also turned into a zombie. He decided to experiment on him to learn more about them, as Charles could still see, hear, and smell, but remembered nothing of his past life. These creatures only craved human flesh and avoided any other food. Strangely, they feared fire, which could repel them. Driven by curiosity, Edward mounted his horse and decided to leave his home, wandering far to see how the world was faring. Along the way, he passed by corpses and skeletons devoured entirely. After a few days of travel, he decided to take a break near a lake to drink some water. As he bent down to drink, a zombie hiding underwater suddenly grabbed him and dragged him down. Edward was terrified but fought with all his strength to prevent the zombie from biting him. After a fierce underwater struggle, Edward managed to overpower the creature and return to the shore, exhausted. While trying to catch his breath, he noticed a group of zombies approaching, and among them was his son Adam. When Edward saw his son after all these years, he was deeply affected, tears streaming down his face at the horrific state his son had reached. He immediately grabbed his weapon and began shooting at the zombies around him, but couldn't bring himself to harm Adam. As Adam got closer and grabbed him, Edward hugged him tightly to avoid being bitten, screaming in anguish as he was forced to shoot Adam in the head to end his suffering. That night, Edward gathered some branches and made a simple bed. He lit a fire and burned Adam's body in a final farewell. After the burial, he took some of Adam's ashes and placed them in a small metal box. That night, Edward contemplated ending his own life to escape the pain. He drank some alcohol, loaded a bullet into his gun, and attempted to shoot himself but stopped after the second attempt. At dawn, Edward encountered a zombie and unleashed all his pent-up anger on it, beating it senseless until it was destroyed. The next morning, he burned down the cabin he had been living in and made a final decision. From now on, his sole purpose was to deliver Adam's ashes to the place his son had always dreamed of visiting, but never got to see before his death. After years of wandering through forests, Edward became a hardened man, indifferent to everything except survival. One day, during a battle, his loyal horse Shiloh was bitten, and the wound began to fester. Despite the horse's pain, Edward insisted on keeping him by his side, as Shiloh was his last companion in the world. But as the horse's condition worsened, Edward decided to end his suffering before he turned into a monster. With tears in his eyes, he bid Shiloh a final farewell. Now, having lost the last being in his life, Edward continued his journey alone, filled with boundless rage. After several days in the forest, he came across an old, destroyed village. Feeling tired and hungry, he decided to search for food. Entering one of the houses, he found the corpse of an old man sitting in a chair. Suddenly, the man's elderly wife attacked him, trying to bite him, but Isaac appeared at the last moment and saved him. After helping him, Isaac pointed his weapon at Edward, asking if he had been bitten. Once assured that Edward was uninfected, Isaac lowered his weapon, and the two hid together from the approaching zombies. Once the creatures left, Isaac unexpectedly struck Edward, knocking him unconscious. When Edward regained consciousness, he found Isaac sitting before him. He realized that Isaac was not his enemy. On the contrary, Isaac was interested in Edward's story and asked about his past. Upon learning that Edward was a soldier in the war, Isaac requested his help to rescue his sister, who had been kidnapped by a general named Williams. Williams led a group of rebels hiding in an underground bunker. Isaac knew all the passages there, as he had helped build them in the past. However, since Williams was always surrounded by his crazed men, Isaac needed a partner to navigate the hideout. Since Edward had lost his wife and son and had no purpose left in life, he couldn't refuse when he saw a man pleading for help to save a family member. From that moment, Edward and Isaac became a deadly team, taking down zombies one by one, with no one able to stand in their way. Although Edward wasn't sure if Isaac's sister was still alive, he pursued the mission with determination. One night, as they sat by the fire sharing memories, Isaac excused himself to relieve himself, leaving Edward alone. Suddenly, Wayne emerged from the darkness, held a gun to Edward's head, and stole his weapon. Shortly after, Williams himself appeared, struck Edward, and kidnapped him to take him to the bunker. Williams intended to use Edward as a test subject for his experiments. Since Isaac had been hiding during the attack, he could only act at dawn to track them down and rescue his companion. That same night, Edward was imprisoned with other captives and learned that Williams deliberately spread the infection to see who might develop immunity to the virus. While imprisoned, Edward met Emma, who had been held there for weeks. All infected individuals were examined by a doctor named Johnson, who conducted numerous experiments to find a cure for the disease. Despite months of research, he had made no progress. Williams, growing impatient, threatened Johnson, warning that if he didn't produce a cure within days, the infected would be fed to the monsters. The next day, when Emma was about to be taken for infection testing, Edward tried to convince the guards to let him take her place. At that moment, Isaac suddenly appeared, attacked the guard, and saved them. He began to escape with them from the bunker. As soon as Williams noticed that people were trying to escape, he ran after them and shot Edward. But at that moment, a zombie attacked Williams and devoured him right in front of their eyes. Isaac saw his friend injured, so he carried him on his shoulder and ran until they reached a cabin in the middle of the forest. The cabin belonged to an old woman named Eve, who was a healer. Isaac knocked on the door frantically, screaming and begging her to help. Emma, who was with him, thought no one was inside until the door slowly opened on its own. But as soon as they entered, the door slammed shut unexpectedly. Emma began screaming and banging on the door. Isaac tried to break it down to save her, but then Eve appeared, recognizing Emma because they had met when they were younger. The woman opened the door and asked Isaac to bring Edward in quickly so she could try to save him. When she saw Edward's condition, drenched in sweat and pale-faced, she told them his condition was critical and that he might not survive. She gave him medicine to ease the pain and then began cleaning his wound to remove the bullet. Edward endured intense pain and passed out, likely from the agony and blood loss. Eve told them that if Edward's wound became infected, he wouldn't survive. By dawn, Edward woke up from his coma, and Eve applied a special ointment she had prepared to his wound. Edward thanked her for what she had done for him, and Eve was deeply moved since no one had thanked her in years. Later, Eve took Isaac and Emma aside and explained that the traps around the cabin were set to catch zombies. She told them that anyone who accidentally triggered the traps would hit the bells hanging around the door, and when the bells rang, she would know danger was near. Even after Edward began to recover, he and his companions decided to stay with Eve on the hill for a while until they figured out their next move. Since they had become like a family, they divided the work among themselves. Isaac became responsible for protecting the cabin, always armed and ready for anything. Once Edward fully recovered, he joined Isaac in guarding the cabin. Meanwhile, Edward resumed writing his memoirs, documenting everything he had witnessed. Over time, the zombie attacks became more frequent, and nearly every night, they faced unexpected visits from the undead. They spent their nights fighting and their mornings burying bodies. One day, something happened that they weren't prepared for. Emma was bitten. Isaac was devastated and prepared his gun to put her out of her misery before she turned. But suddenly, Emma shocked him by saying she wouldn't turn because her immunity was different, and the disease had never affected her. She confessed that she had been bitten long ago while trying to help a sick neighbor, and since then, her body had become immune to the disease. Eve quickly approached Emma to examine the old bite mark and asked how this was possible. Emma explained that before the military took her, she had been trying to treat her sick neighbor when she was bitten. Strangely, she had never fallen ill or turned. Days passed and Emma didn't even catch a cold or fever. One night, Edward woke up startled from a nightmare and saw Eve leaving the cabin. He quickly followed her and Kelly, called out to ask what was wrong. Eve opened up to him and shared a story from her past. She told him that she once lived with her younger sister Julia. One terrible night, two drunk men attacked Julia and destroyed her life forever. A week later, Eve discovered that Julia was pregnant and decided to terminate the pregnancy so Julia wouldn't have to live with the pain of what had happened. But when the townspeople found out, they turned against her, accusing her of terrible things and sentenced Julia to death. On the day of the execution, Eve stood among the crowd, helpless to save her sister. Afterward, Eve had no choice but to curse the townspeople. She was exiled from the town and treated like a criminal, given just 24 hours to leave forever. She wandered the forest for days, starving and cut off from the world, with only the clothes on her back. One day, she met a woman named Melinda, who lived in the cabin they were now staying in. Melinda took Eve in and taught her everything about herbal medicine and ancient remedies. When Melinda passed away, Eve found some old scrolls containing incantations and rituals written hundreds of years ago. Among them was a dangerous ritual capable of bringing the dead back to life. Desperate, Eve clung to the hope of bringing her sister Julia back. She studied the rituals carefully and, when she felt ready, retrieved Julia's body from the grave and brought it to the cabin. She prepared everything for the ritual and waited for a sign, but nothing happened. Exhausted, she fell asleep next to Julia's corpse. Suddenly, she woke to the sound of loud banging at the cabin door. She looked up and saw Julia standing there, seemingly alive. Overwhelmed with joy, Eve thought her dream had come true. But her joy turned into a nightmare when Julia began attacking her first victims. When Edward heard this story, he realized he was standing before the woman responsible for the zombie apocalypse that had destroyed the world and taken his family from him. But when he saw the genuine sorrow and regret in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to blame her. He understood that all she had wanted was to bring her sister back to life. Eve continued, explaining that according to the ancient scrolls, this outbreak of the undead had happened before at different points in human history. Each time, it was linked to something terrifying and hidden that connected the two worlds. A few days later, Isaac and Edward noticed their ammunition was running low. They decided to raid General Williams's bunker to steal more supplies. In the dead of night, they gathered a crate of ammunition and sneaked out quietly through the forest. But Cliff had been following them from a distance. The next morning, Edward felt he needed to continue his journey to the waterfall where he had always dreamed of scattering his son Adam's ashes. Feeling he had delayed long enough, he said goodbye to his friends and left, promising to return soon. But what Edward didn't know was that the three of them were in grave danger. Cliff had discovered their location and also learned that there was a woman among them immune to the virus. One night, Williams gathered a group of experienced fighters and planned to attack the cabin, capturing everyone inside. His goal was to use Emma as a test subject to find a cure for the disaster and to capture Eve, whom he blamed for the curse that had plagued the earth. After weeks of walking, Edward finally reached the waterfall his son had dreamed of seeing. He scattered Adam's ashes into the air, feeling as though his son's spirit had merged with the breeze. After an emotional farewell moment, he decided to go back to see his friends. The cabin was a shock. Everything was in ruins. Eve was lying on the ground, severely injured. Edward rushed to her quickly to help her. She was barely alive, whispered to him that his friends had been kidnapped by the general and his men. After telling him that, Eve took her last breath. At that moment, Edward felt he would not let their rights be taken away. That same night, he painted his face with lines of blood and dirt to disguise himself among the zombies. He entered the forest and started screaming at the top of his lungs to attract the zombies' attention. His plan was brilliant. He wanted to gather as many zombies as possible and lead them toward the hideout, letting them attack Williams and his men. On the way, he encountered a guard standing at the hideout's door and didn't hesitate for a moment. He raised his weapon and shot him in the head. The guard fell in place and some zombies behind Edward stopped to feed on him while the rest continued following him in a straight line. As soon as Williams heard loud screams coming from inside the hideout, he knew there was trouble. He grabbed his weapon and started moving through the corridors, prepared for any attack. Suddenly, he found himself face to face with a horde of zombies. Cornered, he was forced to shoot them to protect himself. Meanwhile, Edward was working on another plan. He was searching for Emma, and when he found her, he didn't waste time. He shot Dr. Gibson in the head immediately, killing him on the spot, and helped Emma get to her feet before they escaped. Edward and Emma ran toward the cells to free his friends and the other prisoners. But as they were escaping, Cliff suddenly appeared, shouting and firing at them. The zombies took advantage of the moment and attacked him. Unfortunately, one of Edward's friends was hit by a bullet and couldn't continue with them. As he was dying, he held Edward's hand and said in a broken voice, "Take care of Emma. You must finish off Williams and his gang." After those sorrowful moments, Edward and Emma barely escaped that hell. Outside, Edward told Emma, "Go to the cabin, wait there, and don't show yourself until dawn. I have an old score to settle tonight." The revenge battle began at midnight. Edward lured Williams and Cliff into the forest, trying to stay hidden. He knew well he couldn't face them both at once. His plan was simple and clever: separate them and trap one of them. While running in the dark, he managed to make Cliff chase him alone. He led him to a spot where zombies were hiding, waiting for their chance. Cliff fell into the trap and found no escape. Cornered, he tried to fend off the zombies. At that moment, Edward seized the opportunity and started pursuing his real target, Williams. But Cliff was stubborn. He managed to hold off the zombies for a while and escaped from them. He tried to run after Edward, not realizing that he was doing exactly what Edward wanted, bringing himself closer and closer to the disaster prepared for him. During the chase, Cliff fell into a pit full of zombies. While he struggled to escape them, Edward took the chance and finished him off quickly. Without wasting time, Edward immediately ran after Williams. He crossed a small river and hid behind a tree on the other side. Suddenly, as he was hiding, he saw his enemy, who was focused solely on his personal mission of revenge. When Williams saw how determined Edward was, he tried to convince him to join him. He told him that the evil woman had manipulated his mind and that this wasn't what he was supposed to do. But Williams quickly realized he wouldn't be able to change Edward's mind. He said, Then let's settle this like knights." They put their weapons aside and stepped out from behind the trees. As they moved along the riverbank, Williams tried to convince Edward, looking him directly in the eyes, saying, "She is the key. Emma might be the one to save us and give us a chance to find a cure." But Edward stood firm and said with determination, "I'd rather live in a world full of zombies than live in a world like yours." At that moment, Williams drew his weapon to shoot, but Edward was faster and pulled the trigger first. With one shot, Williams fell. After his enemy was defeated, Edward ran quickly toward the cabin. When he arrived, he felt relief seeing that Emma was safe. Despite her grief over losing Eve and her brother, Emma found comfort in Edward's embrace and began to find new hope in life. After everything he had been through, Edward realized that a life filled with vengeance wasn't worth living. He decided to give himself a chance to start anew. On the last page of his journal, he wrote, "Even in a world full of zombies, you can choose to hold on to hope and move forward, especially if there's someone beside you worth fighting for." That's it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next epic story.